Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar. I'm just going to give a few minutes because there's quite a few people joining right now before we get started on tonight's webinar, which is very exciting. Whilst we're waiting for some more attendees to join, just some housekeeping. As we know, tonight's webinar is a continuing education webinar, and you will each receive 1 CE credit for attending. That should come via your email in sort of 7 to 10 business days. Just want to thank our sponsors, Henry Schein, for putting on tonight's webinar with us. We've got a fantastic show or webinar tonight. We're delighted to be joined by Stream Dental, Samantha Leonard and Dr. Sam Daha. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them. You should see a poll come on the screen very shortly. Just an introductory poll whilst we're waiting for some more attendees to join. If you could just take a minute just to fill in a couple of questions, just help to sort of describe the current situation, reason for taking the course. If you have a lease, when does that expire? If you're planning on starting or buying a new practice, and if you're interested in a complimentary lease or rent review. This just gives us an idea of the kind of people and sort of position in terms of, so we can make it a little bit more specific to where everybody's at in their stage of their career. I'll just give that another minute as we've got some other people joining, and then we'll get stuck in. So thank you everyone again for joining tonight's Risk Management as an Employer and a Dental Tenant, co-hosted by myself, Lee Tesco, one of the senior consultants here at Cirrus Consulting Group. And we're delighted to have Dr. Sam Daha and Samantha Leonard from Stream Dental, which was founded around 7 years ago. They specialize in helping dental practice in finding top recruit talent and creating strategic human resource programs for dental practices. Dr. Sam Daha is bilingual native from Montreal, received his degree at McGill University. He's given over 400 conferences worldwide, became an adjunct associate professor at the University of the Pacific in San Francisco. He's currently associate as a professor at the University de Montreal, and along with establishing Alina, the Institute and Treatment Planning Service and Consulting Platform. And he is also obviously the co-founder of Stream HR. He actually was one of Cirrus's first clients. Way back, I don't want to show his age, but way back when Cirrus was only just founded, and which is really great to have him speaking tonight. So we will look forward to hearing more from Dr. Daha. Samantha has been in the dental industry for over 15 years. She's worked in every role, worn every hat, led and became an operational manager, well-respected and well-renowned orthodontist to Dr. Sam Daha. Together, they built a multi-million-dollar practice from scratch. They've expanded 6 locations across the country. She's passionate about helping the dental community build their dream and establish an effective HR and safety program. So we're really looking forward to hearing a lot more about that in the second part of tonight's presentation. We want it to be, as interactive as we can. We're here. You can see us, and there is a question and an answer section as well. I can see some people already chatting away from where they're from. So we will have a separate question and answer section later on. But if you do have any sort of questions, feel free to use that question and answer section. So let's crack on. As you've met the presenters. So what's the purpose of today's webinar? Really, during the last 18 months, life has changed probably forever. I mean, we're hoping that we're sort of starting to come out of the other side now of COVID, but whether it's starting a practice, relocating, expanding, transitioning, every dentist has had to think about things a lot differently now. So we're going to talk about some of the sort of compliance through COVID times. Like I said, starting a practice, what is the right way with the HR help, and also protecting your practice with the dental office lease. And if you're acquiring or selling a practice, how do you, get the most important contracts in order? Especially during COVID, there's been a lot of staffing issues and what people's rights are in terms of from an employer to an employee standpoint. So we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. And we're also going to talk about the importance of a well-crafted dental office lease as an owner-occupier. And we'll have a little look at some of the local real estate updates, and we're going to give some technical examples of some tips and tricks that you may find in your lease. So just a little bit about Cirrus and who we are. I think it's important that you understand who we are. And we've been representing the dental community, like I said, for over 25 years now. Essentially, we are a healthcare and dental specialist representation firm. We've negotiated probably over 12,000 dental and medical office leases since inception. And what makes us unique is we do everything in-house. So we have a team of lease negotiators, all comprised of real estate attorneys, some with a background in healthcare, some former real estate brokers, some that actually we've hired from the landlord, from the dark side. So we certainly a very niche experience there. We deliver over 500 continuing education seminars, webinars these days, not so much live seminars, but we hope to get back to seeing everybody in person next year. As you know, I said tonight's webinar is there is one CE credit awarded for attending, and we work with dentists and healthcare professionals nationwide. I just wanted to give you a little example of some of our recent customers. Sorry. Western Canada was where originally Cirrus was founded by dentists for dentists, really for the reason that the landlord was taking advantage of the dental tenant. As you know, it's an expensive business to enter into, and it can be a very profitable business when it comes to transitioning. So we're very proud that we've supported the dental community, and especially in Western Canada. And there's probably a few names on this screen that you recognize that we've represented. We continue to strive for that, success, and really helping the dental tenant realize that, that they're becoming very much an anchor tenant, a very, important tenant that statistically will stay in their space for over 20 years. They have the lowest default rate in the country, and they're not an accountant, they're not lawyers, they can't just move over the weekend. So really how and we'll talk about how important it is the lease is structured correctly. We do have access to over 95 billion square foot of real estate. We pay for a lot of proprietary data. So not just from the inventory that we have that comes through and some of the clients that we've worked with, we also pay for a lot of real estate data to look at some of the current rental rates and vacancies in the market, which helps. I have to just say before I go through some of the real estate metrics that we've pulled, that obviously some of the slides, they contain some trends in the real estate markets. There's no guarantees or predictions of future performance. And, some of these, please bear in mind, are, specific to a location, not necessarily your location, not necessarily the type of building that you may be in. So if you want to get a little bit more of a detailed rent analysis of your practice, then please feel free to reach out. We can certainly dig much deeper into your specific location and area. So I just wanted to give a quick market update in terms of what we've been seeing year on year. The market has been growing. It's about 4% in terms of real estate metrics, and from an availability rate, obviously since COVID, we've seen a rise in availability in terms of spaces, as COVID has certainly had an effect on a lot of the retail industry, unfortunately having to, either gone bankrupt or locations and things have been closed down. This just talks about some of the year-on-year national leasing activity. So some of the activity during COVID has, as expected, has dropped a little bit in terms of some of the activity and movement from the highs of 2017, 2018. I also just pulled out a few specific in terms of Western Canada, in terms of Vancouver and Calgary. So the blue line is what you can see is the current rental rates. And then the orange line is in terms of vacancy rates. Now, again, you have to take Vancouver, you have to take each market specific to the demographic. Vancouver is still in high demand and rents are still going up, and vacancies, as you can see, have actually been dropping, whereas Calgary's slightly different. I mean, the forecast is that rents will start to go up in 2022 as vacancies go down. And if we look at Edmonton and Winnipeg, so Edmonton, as you can see, there was a bit of an inverse relation between the vacancies and the rental rate, in terms of, which is probably expected, as you saw the vacancy rates starting to come down, rental rates go up. So, I mean, the overall thing what is, if you have the opportunity now, we're sort of coming out of that period where landlords are not necessarily listening to, COVID as an excuse, or as much of a leverage as maybe they did a year ago. That doesn't mean to say we can't negotiate, and they're not incentivizing, but for some people that have maybe not sat on their hands, but don't want to do anything, what you can see, what normally happens is, once we come out of the other side, there will be the demand will go up and rental rates will start to increase. Regina and Victoria, again, looks like the vacancy rates are going to go up in Regina and Victoria. Not sure what happened to the rental rate line there. Anyway, let's move on to a lease. What is a lease? Now, this is one of the questions I ask at all my webinars and seminars, because I think I normally like it to be interactive, but in this case, I'm going to just tell you it's a check, and it's probably one of the biggest checks that you will write in your professional dentist career, except for maybe your residential purchase, what we try to explain and what I want to get across tonight, if you're not going to maybe walk away as experts, what I want you to understand is that yes, the financials and the legal provisions in the lease, you may just sign and look at the first page, put it in the drawer and have a look at it again in 10 years. What I want to try and explain is, even if an average 2,000 square foot space, if you're paying, say, $5,000 a month in rent, you're talking $60,000 per annum. You know, that's 10 years, $600,000, and that's not even including any rent escalations. And like I said earlier, statistically, dentists will stay in the space for over 20 years. So when you sign that first lease, or when you sign an extension, etc., you know, you're writing a check for over $1 million. And it's important for you to understand that you are a valuable tenant to the landlord as well. So why is the office lease so important? Like I said, if you drove up to your practice tomorrow, you got your Tim Hortons or Starbucks coffee or whatever your choice of beverage is, and you pulled up to the practice and there was a notice on the front door saying you've got 30 days and you're going to be, the practice is going to be demolished or you're being relocated, whatever it is, right? What are you going to do? Because like I said, you can't move. Your location is the foundation of your practice. And as we know, it can be very profitable, but it's also very expensive and time consuming to move. I'm sure some of the Henry Schein equipment specialist reps that I know Cornell's are listening, but will tell you, you're looking at $150, $200 per square foot to build out a practice, and not just the permits, and it's very time consuming as well. And also when it comes to selling the practice, the lease, your landlord really will control the consent that if you want to sell your practice or not. We had a client that had found a buyer, and he dotted the I's, crossed the T's, and at the 25th hour, he's asking the landlord just for approval to assign the lease, and the landlord pretty much gave him three choices. One of them was no, and to terminate the lease, simply just terminate the lease just for asking to actually transfer the lease. The second choice was that it was going to increase rents by 15%. And the third choice, not so much choice, just because of the language that was written in the lease, was, and he knew that this was at the 25th hour and there was a large transaction taking place, he wanted some of the proceeds of the sale, which in my opinion is crazy, but we've seen it, it's happened. And I can tell you in this example, the seller who was selling the practice for over $2 million and was pretty much on the beach already, he had to cut a check for $136,000 to the landlord just to make sure that he could get out of the lease. So again, that is why the office lease is so important. I am a bit conscious of time. In terms of buying versus leasing, I do want you to be aware and ensure that some people will say, well, I don't have a lease, I own the building, what do I need? What's the difference between buying and leasing? Again, if you're buying, requires a large upfront investment. You become a landlord, so you don't have to report to anybody, and you can make changes to the space and get freedom, whereas leasing requires a smaller upfront payment. You do have greater working capital towards building out a practice, and then you have the flexibility to relocate or expand. Again, we can touch on buying versus leasing it's pretty much a separate webinar, a separate conference. So in terms of starting a practice and looking at protecting your future, for a dental office lease, there's the 7 financial negotiables in your lease. And these are really, really important. And I think it's important just to stress that, it's not just the base rent where you're looking at what's the dollar per square foot. The annual increases, what does that go up if you signed a 10-year lease? Is that increasing by, inflation with consumer price index? Is that increasing more? Is that increasing less? Common area maintenance, you'll find majority of leases now are triple net leases, whereby you will pay the base rent and then you will pay an additional operating expenses for your CAM, your common area maintenance, and your tax and insurance. If you are starting a practice, there's going to be a fixturing period. When we get involved, we want to make sure that there's enough time between actually getting possession of this space to when the fixturing period, when they actual build out and you're ready to turn key. So we're looking at sort of 3 to 6 months of free rent. Is there any tenant improvement work? Is there a landlord offering? And in some cases, it's not always smart just to take the tenant improvement allowance money. Bank rates are low, and there's no such thing as free money where I come from. So if the landlord is offering some, he's going to price that into the rents, and the chances are after about 6 or 7 years, you're going to be paying that and more back. So again, it's just about understanding if the landlord's going to give you $50,000 and the rent's going to go and it's going to cost you $100,000 over a period, then you have to work that out. This is just into an interesting chart in terms of when you're starting a practice, really more about building a team and what's involved in starting a practice. And then when it comes to acquiring or selling a practice, I want to avoid some of the $100,000 mistakes through the assignment clause, which is what I explained earlier in terms of the doctor who had to cut a large check to the landlord to sell the practice. So there's certain terms to be careful when transitioning. We're going to look at the assignment provision in a little bit more detail, but consideration language, exactly what I said. Is the landlord entitled to any consideration? Is the language in the lease vague? Is it open for interpretation? We want to make sure that there's a lot of clarity and there's no gray area, no vague language. There's other personal guarantee, there's other surrender of premises and other terms, again, that you need to be careful of. So in terms of the assignment clause, really what that does and defines the transfer to another party of a tenant's interest in a lease for the remainder of the lease, normally in conjunction with the sale or an acquisition of the practice. Now, what we want it to do is to allow a seamless transaction to take place, be able to sell to an accredited dental practitioner, and relieve of any further continuing liability. Now, that is the ideal solution. Many leases that I read, and I read every day, dental office leases that have opposite language. In some cases, continuing liability after sale, termination language, like I said, just for asking to assign the lease, the landlord could terminate the lease. So we're just going to have a quick look at an assignment provision. So this is found in 75% of dental leases. Now, again, just for the interest of time, I'm going to just run through some of the red flags that we see that are common in an assignment provision. So first of all, you have to receive consent from the landlord. Now that is normal. The landlord is not going to just sell to or let you transfer the lease to anybody. That is normal. What we're talking about is what sort of consent. What does that consent look like? Like I said, and I gave the example here, landlord gave 3 choices: decline, terminate. They can approve the request. It's not all doom and gloom, but in some cases, they know that they can increase rent. They know that there's an opportunity in a large transaction that's going to take place. Here it actually says landlords shall have the right to revise the minimum rent paid during the remainder of the term to greater the current market rent for the leased premises, or 15% greater. So you may have agreed all the financials, and suddenly your new buyer has just been hit with a 15% rent increase. Now, if that was me, the first thing I would probably do is want to take 15% off the asking price that I've just submitted. Again, don't leave any money on the table, or don't leave any money to the landlord, that's for sure. This is that consideration language that I was talking about. Should tenant receive from the assignee or subtenant any rental income, any consideration, any form in connection with the assignment or the lease, they know that you've been there. As far as they're concerned, their location, their building has helped build, a successful practice. You've been there over 20 years. And this language is very common. It shouldn't be in there for, it's not written for healthcare tenants. And then the final thing, as we see, is after we may get through and actually get permission for the landlord to, get the landlord's consent to sell the practice and transfer it, there's still some continuing liability that the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable. Had a doctor that was retired and moved to Florida, got a phone call 4 years later after retirement saying that the buyer that he sold the practice to had taken on too much debt and gone bankrupt, and he was after him for the remaining 6 years of the lease. Now, the last thing that dentist wants to do is go back and start practicing. I'm sure Dr. Daha would probably attain to the last phone call he want to receive after working a long period of his life. So again, this is just one provision, and there's 5 or 6 huge red flags, and the cost of this mistake, anything from $250,000 to $750,000. Inability to sell the practice, having to absorb a significant increase in rent, remaining liable, as a guarantor beyond practice sale, and paying the landlord a portion of your sale proceeds. Again, for the interest of time, there are 20 other provisions that we look at rigorously to make sure that there's no additional red flags in terms of demolition, disability, relocation. There's just a number of other clauses as well that you need to be aware of. I just want to touch on, I mentioned it a little bit earlier in terms of a well-crafted lease as you're an owner-occupier. Now, in some cases, you own the building and you own the practice, and people think, well, I don't need a lease. What do I need a lease for? I rent to myself. Well, there's a couple of reasons. There's a few reasons. Mitigating risk and exposure. It's very important to separate the two entities. You would probably set up 2 different entities, and also, like, what's your plan? Are you own the building? You plan to be a landlord? You plan to keep the real estate and sell the dental practice? Do you plan to sell both? For tax reasons as well. And one of the most important things is for the practice sale, anyone that wants to come in, they want to see a history of rental payments. They want to see a history, at least 3 years of history. And that doesn't mean just pulling out any number out of the sky. I mean, I'm not an accountant, but we certainly there's some tax savings that can be made, but also make sure that they're in line with sort of current rental rates. So it's still extremely important, and something that we can help with when it comes to if you own your own practice. It increases the property value as well. So why have Cirrus? Why have we been successful, and how have we been successful in doing this for over 25 years and winning lease negotiations? Lots of people ask, well, wow, Why are they going to talk to you? Why are they going to, well, why my landlord's a nightmare, he's not going to do anything. Well, again, it's really all about the strategy. It's all about having the information, gathering the documentation, identifying what your plans are, and understanding the value that you have as a tenant. So where we differ is, like I said, there's 5 or 6 steps that we do before we even reach out to the landlord. We don't just, and I hope that some of you tonight don't just look at your lease or start phoning your landlord and say, have I got this or that, right? You need to take a step back. The landlords they do this every single day. This is what they do. They know how to squeeze the tenants, and really that's where we come in, and we have a strategy, and we don't go in guns blazing. We're not trying to upset any relations, but we'll spend 15-20 hours on some of the financial economics. And once you have a financially motivated landlord, from our experience, it's easier then to make some changes to the legal provisions, which essentially don't always impact the landlord, detrimentally impact the landlord. A lot of it is, for our practice, if I'm going to stay here for the next 20 years, there's a few things that I need to make sure are in place to protect my practice and protect the future and the predictability, right? If I'm going to commit to 10-20 year lease, and that landlords at the end of the day, they have shareholders, they have, depending on different portfolios, they want to know who's my tenant, how long is he staying there, and is he paying rent, and for how long is he paying there for. So again, we've had over 300 5-star Google reviews, extreme success in terms of representing thousands of clients to make sure, and majority have said it's the best money that they've spent on their practice. Now, I am conscious of time, and I know that looking forward to our other partners speaking tonight. So I just wanted to mention one other thing. So what we provide is a critical dates and risk analysis. Now, there's a normal value here of 1995, and what we do, we spend 3-4 hours analyzing your lease. We look at the lease for any traps, any liabilities or areas of concern. We would then schedule a call. We would understand a little bit about where you've been and your vision and plan, and in terms of the future. We'll obviously talk about what's in the lease and what that means for you, and what the ideal lease should look like, and discuss a treatment plan and how to negotiate effectively, whether you're renewing, expanding, relocating, looking to transition. Now, thankfully, thanks to our sponsors, and for those of you who've taken the time to attend tonight, we are offering a complimentary personalized lease review. It is on a first come, first served basis. So if you are interested, I would strongly recommend you email info@Cirrus Consulting Group. There's my number there. If you are interested, it really is an hour call, and it's very, very beneficial. So before I pass over to our friends at Stream Dental, we do have a closing poll. If you could just take a minute to fill out. Again, I know that there was a poll at the beginning. This just slightly different. If you are a tenant today, if you do have a lease, if you know when it expires, if you own a building, and if you're interested in the complimentary lease review, again, please make it clear. Myself and some of my associates will reach out, and it's a first come, first served basis, and it's normally a very popular demand, the complimentary lease review. So I will pass over the reins to my good friends at Stream, Dr. Dahar and Samantha. I'm going to just stop sharing. Or do I have to just give you access? Will you request access?
Awesome. All right. Thank you very much, Lee. I learned a lot of great information from that. So thank you so much. I'm going to switch some gears, obviously, for us to be able to talk a little bit more about a different type of business tactic that will help minimize the risk and exposure by having the best HR and compliance strategies as we're trying to navigate and live and operate our business as we're trying to get through this pandemic and prepare ourselves for a post-COVID world. Now, I know that many of you probably are feeling the exact same way that I do, where I just want to hit that fast forward button and just kind of zip right past this global pandemic and get us to the other side. But the reality is the aftermath of this global pandemic has really changed the landscape of how our practices are going to be operating, not just here in 2021, but beyond. So with that time period, we've seen such massive changes, not only when it comes to employment standards, but health and safety regulations, but now we're seeing major HR issues transpiring. And some of those things I'm sure you're feeling right now in your business. Maybe you've been experiencing this great resignation that has fallen upon us, where we are seeing a high number of employee turnover happening, or we're seeing a decrease of employee engagement with our current team members, and not to mention this massive shortage of candidates. So all of these pieces are impacting your business, not only your bottom line, but it's impacting your culture, your patient experience, your production, and your success, which means we need to have a new strategy. We need new resources. We need new support systems, and those systems need to include HR and compliance, because that's what's going to protect our business. And it's going to set up our team and our business to be able to get through this last piece of this pandemic, get us out of the survival mode that we've been operating in for the last 2 years and go into growth mode, into thriving mode, so that we can continue to build your legacy. Now, the best way forward is to really take a step back and to learn from the lessons that we faced over this last 2 years. So I know I was talking about fast forwarding, but right now we're going to rewind. We're going to rewind and we're going to reflect about what has happened over the last few years. So let's go back. It's March 2020. We've just received this crazy news that we need to close the door of our practice. And we're just about to enter into this new sets of challenges and problems that we have never been prepared for. And this is probably highlighting some of the big holes in our business operating systems right now. And one of them is probably HR and safety systems, or maybe the lack thereof. So we're going to dive into the top 5 HR compliance misses that we have seen happen over the last 2 years to be able to really see what can we do right now to avoid some of the big risks that many of us were affected by over the last 2 years. So the first thing we're going to dive into is not having an employment agreement. Now, employment agreements are probably one of the most important documents, aside from making sure that you've got the right leases rightly. It's one of the most important documents that we have when it comes to our employment relationship, because it outlines the terms of that working relationship. So it talks about compensation, hours of work, vacation entitlement, probationary periods, severance, termination clauses, temporary layoffs, so on and so forth. But now we're here in 2020, and we are having to close our doors. We're having to lay off our team members. And we have no clue how long our office is going to be closed for, how long they're going to be laid off for. And now we realize that we don't have an employment agreement in place. So that is number one of the reasons why there was a lot of vulnerabilities and risks, which actually leads right into point number 2. Which is one of the other common mistakes that we saw was not having the right temporary layoff entitlements included in your employment agreement. Now, extended temporary layoffs are not generally a part of employment standards, and it's actually reliant on the existence of an employment agreement. So if an employer didn't have specific temporary layoff clauses in their agreements, then we didn't really have the capability to legally lay off our team members for a long period of time. So this is where the domino effect really began. Laying off our team members without written employment agreements in effect, or maybe we did have employment agreements, but they were maybe 20 years old and they didn't have that language which referred to temporary layoffs. And that is what exposed many of those layoffs to be actually classified as constructive dismissal. So before I actually start talking a little bit more about this topic, I actually want to kind of spend a few minutes here just diving into what the definition of constructive dismissal is. So it's a unilateral change and a substantial change to a fundamental term of the employment relationship. So what is that? Well, in layman's terms, basically a fundamental relationship in the employment is the employee will work and the employer will pay them for that work. So if the employer unilaterally decides and declares that that employee is not able to work anymore for a period of time unknown and is not going to get paid for that time, that is a substantial change to a fundamental term in that employment agreement. Okay, so I hope you tuck that back in your mind because we're going to talk, you'll hear that term come up a few times. All right, so fast forward, we're here, it's November 17, 2021. Many of the exemptions that came into play at the initial onset of the pandemic when we did our first lockdown, a lot of those exemptions were there to protect the business with this layoff. But now those have expired and those have rescinded. And now we're starting to see more and more claims of constructive dismissal arising due to these layoffs, due to pay cuts, reduction in hours, and how that was handled during this pandemic. And I'm going to take a brief moment and I'm going to give some kudos to our team because we had actually been recommending that our clients have that temporary layoff clause in their contract. We set that up in their employment agreements. So when they were faced with that dire decision that they had to make to lay off their team, they already had the necessary protocols and policies in place to really mitigate their risk. And they reaped the benefits and continue to do so. Now, the risk to our business of this temporary layoff doesn't just exist during this anomaly of this global pandemic. So it's not, oh, well, I didn't have any effects, none of those issues really impacted me. So I guess I'm in the clear, right? I don't have to worry about this. But there are other reasons and other factors that could actually cause us to close our doors and temporarily lay off our team members. Maybe there's a drop in business. Maybe we become ill and we cannot see our patients. And we're actually seeing a real life example happen right now in Abbotsford, BC, where part of the city is literally underwater. Now, if your dental practice was right at the epicenter of that, obviously you can't see patients, you can't have your team members come in. So perhaps those practices right now are having to do a repeat of laying off their team members. So if we didn't have this before, it's really important for us to make sure that we have this in our practice right now to prepare us for any future crisis or disaster. Another issue that we have seen during this global pandemic was mishandling accommodations due to COVID-19. Now, an employer cannot discipline or dismiss an employee who is unable to work due to COVID-19. Because if we do so, then that actually constitutes as discrimination according to the human rights legislation and or a break of employment standards legislation. So if an employee is unable to work due to COVID-19, so whether that's because of a family member or maybe a child cannot go to school anymore, or maybe they have to isolate, then the employer should assess their legal obligations when it comes to duty to accommodate. And several provinces have actually amended their employment legislation to be able to provide several COVID-19 related leaves. And most of them are unpaid, but they are job protected leaves. Now, during the pandemic, I'm sure you probably experienced, it was a little slow at times. Maybe people were a little worried to come back to the practice. They were a little hesitant with the numbers that were so high at some point. So maybe we didn't have enough workload to be able to support our 5 full-time hygienists, but maybe our workload can only support 3 out of the 5 hygienists. So maybe we had to reduce some of our hours, or maybe we had to reduce some pay to be able to keep the business afloat. But just like layoffs, imposing a reduction of hours or pay can actually trigger constructive dismissal. Remember what that was? A unilateral change to the fundamental terms of the employment agreement, which is now including hours of work and compensation. Now, when it comes to compensation, if it was just a nominal reduction of pay, maybe 5 to 10%, that wouldn't, trigger a constructive dismissal. But in certain provinces, if the reduction is more than 10%, 15%, 20%, it likely will kick in. And in some cases, if you have the proper language in the clauses in your employment agreements, it actually gives you the right to do a reduction in pay. So I'm hoping I'm making my case clear here about why it's so important to have those employment agreements and how it mitigates a lot of risk within your business. But last, but certainly not least, in the 5 top mistakes that we saw happen was failing to update your employee policies and procedures. Now, employee handbooks are essential because they are going to help articulate your company's mission, your values. It's going to set the precedents and the standards of employee behavior and performance. And this is also going to ensure that you are compliant with laws and regulations, but it's also going to help minimize your legal risk. Now, to mitigate these risks, that's where you need to make sure that you're keeping all of these policies and protocols up to date so that it reflects all of the changes that happen every single year when employment standards change. So for example, if you have an employee handbook that was made before 2020, it's likely extremely out of date right now, especially with the new changes in employment standards, protected leaves, COVID-19 safety guidelines. These are all the issues that are critically impacting both employers and employees, which is why we always say that an HR is much more than an employee handbook, because oftentimes we think of a book, sits on a shelf, collects dust, but an employee handbook it needs to evolve. It needs to adapt because your business is dynamic. The world is constantly changing, and we need to make sure that our business is protected with having the right policies and protocols. We can't emphasize this enough about how important that needs to be in there so that you're not making your business vulnerable. Now, what if you don't have a practice quite yet? Maybe you're in the process of starting your practice. What can you do right now to set your business, your team, and your patients up for success? Well, as a startup, you have a very amazing opportunity right now. You can set this great foundation up for your business so that your team can grow and thrive. When you lay the groundwork right now to have a solid HR strategy and program, it's better to have it in place before you actually need it, right? Because it's easier to prevent a headache than it is to repair one. So your HR department is meant to not only help protect your business, but also your employees. But it's also there to help inspire, motivate, and lead your greatest assets, your human capital. In other words, we need HR systems to be able to support our business and our people. Because as our business evolves, we go through different stages, and so does our employee life cycle. In order for us to be able to create a happy and a great culture, we need to have those systems and support and resources to make them thrive. Just like there is a different stages in the patient cycle for our business. So when that new patient calls you, they book an appointment, they come into the office, you take them to the exam room, you present the treatment, you get them to sign consent forms, you have a special process for checking them out, taking payments, following up. You have a specific system and process for each step of the patient life cycle. In order for them to have a seamless experience, they give you a 5-star Google review. They say yes for them to go ahead with treatment. We need to apply the exact same principle when it comes to the other people side of our business, our team. In that way, we can operate like a well-oiled machine. We provide the best treatment. They're brand ambassadors for us. They help us grow our business. So we need to have the right documents in place for every stage of the life cycle. So from recruitment to onboarding to training, development, when we need to do corrective actions, perhaps there's termination or when they resign. We need to have all of the right pieces in place to support that and to mitigate our risk. So having employment agreements, employee handbooks, job descriptions, new hire documents. In fact, when we work with practices, their HR department, there's over 80 documents in that alone that really prepares for the what if scenarios and to be able to mitigate your risk. Another area to help protect your new business is to have the Occupational Health and Safety Program. Now, your OHS program is designed to do exactly that, keep your team healthy and safe. It's meant to prevent workplace-related illnesses, injuries, or deaths. This is a requirement by law in order for us to comply with not only with OHS, the Act, regulation, and code, but also employment standards. So there's a series of documents and manuals that are required for occupational health and safety. So an occupational health and safety manual, we need to have a health and safety representative. We need to conduct health and safety risk assessments, hazard assessments. We need to build emergency response plans, have a harassment and violence prevention program, COVID-19 safety plan, radiation protection program, sedation safety program. Now, I only listed probably half of that list or a quarter of that list. There is a lot that's involved in order for us to be compliant with occupational health and safety. Now, another program that we need to have in place is when it comes to infection prevention and control. Just like HR and OHS has their sets of policies and protocols, so does infection prevention and control. We need to follow those guidelines for recommended practice to be able to prevent the spread of infection between patients and between employees, which means that we need to have a different set of documents. We need to have an IPC manual. We need to make sure that we have hand hygiene programs, dental unit waterline maintenance programs, sharp safety programs, waste management programs, sterilization, reprocessing, disinfection. We need to make sure not only do we have all of those documents, but we need the proper quality assurance and controls. So logs, forms, checklists, just a few things that we need to have in place. But when we have all those pieces laid out in front of us before we have our employees start on their first day, we are right away establishing a culture of compliance. We are showing them that we are organized. This is our standards. This is what we do to be able to keep not only your family safe, but our patients' family safe. We're be able to explain and communicate our company expectations to mitigate risk. And we're saving time. We're creating a great culture. We're creating accountability, clarity, and it also highlights your values. So when you're starting your practice, you have an amazing opportunity to create conditions to support your ideal practice, because it's much more difficult to accomplish this when you're spending so much time trying to fix bad habits and try to implement new protocols. It's really important to make sure that we have all of this established by day one. Now, what if you're looking to acquire or sell a practice? Dr. Dar, what are some important things that we need to be prepared for?
Well, thank you, Samantha. Thank you, Lee. It's your importance in the organization is what by the position that they give you when you speak, right? Being last. It's funny, I'm listening to Lee, and he's right. I was one of the earlier clients of his company of Cirrus in the late 90s. So that sort of gives away. I've been in practice for almost 28 years, and they did negotiate the lease on my behalf back then because I was a relatively new dentist, and all I understood was crowns, bridges, fillings, class 5 restorations, and all of that. I wouldn't care one bit about what CAM and taxes are. Personal guarantee, option to renew, demolition clause. Who knows? Who cares about this? Well, how about we get the specialists to take care of that? And one of the other points I want to mention to Lee's points is I bought and sold 9 practices over my career. 2 of them I was owner occupier. So I had a lease that was set up and it was an arm's length lease. In other words, when the purchaser purchased my practice, they came in and they said, well, show us your lease. I showed it to them. I said, here it is. We're going to keep it as is. You're not going to change a word other than to transfer. And I was thinking in the back of my mind, I'm going to outsmart them and up the rent a little bit before they take over. It didn't happen, but I'm glad the lease was set up properly in the first place. And it was a generous lease. So anyways, but jumping into HR and Stream Dental, I started this practice with Samantha, who we've worked together for over a decade by now. And we started this out of need. It was the pain that I felt. All of you, most of you are doctors on this call, and so you all understand what I'm talking about. The pain of sort of managing the practice. The dentistry part is the easy part. That's what we go to school for. But one of the 2 things that you look at, your 2 biggest either headaches or liabilities are usually what? The lease and salaries. Really, those are the 2 things that you want to look at in the first place. And those can make the transition as beautiful as possible or as painful as possible, right? So we built this HR firm out of necessity. As an orthodontist, Samantha as my operations manager, going through the trials and tribulations of life, having 6 practices in 3 different provinces is what led us to build this HR. So out of experience, we know where this comes from. And HR is a relatively new term to most of us. What is HR? Is it a salary? Is it an office manual? It's a lot more than that. Both lease and HR are part of the goodwill. In other words, these are intangible, right? So if I purchase a practice and the lease is not renewed and it's moved 5 kilometers down the line, I lose a lot of that goodwill. All these patients may or may not follow. Same thing, if half of the staff quit on me on day 2, then you know what? I lost a big part of the goodwill. I didn't pay for chairs and mirrors and explorers. Those are easy. Henry Schein can provide me with these at a good price, right? This is not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the goodwill, the intangible, the relationship that you cannot put a red price tag on. So these are the kind of things that you want to make sure stay in place. So as a co-founder, as the owner of an HR firm, when COVID hit, ladies and gentlemen, I was just like you. I'm very well versed in HR, but I ain't a lawyer, right? And I don't have an HR degree, but I know how things work. And even then, I was stressed as heck, right? So I actually turned to Samantha Olivia in my office and said, you know what? I'm going to buy one of our own packages. And Samantha laughed. I go, Samantha, I'm actually paying for the package. And you bet the farm I paid for the package. And to this day, she's still surprised because I wanted to go through it, but I was surprised and I handed it over to both Samantha and Olivia. And I said, here's what's happening. Who would I bring back when I open next month? How do I justify? Do I do salary cuts? Do I keep them all? Can I fit 21 employees in 5,000 square feet? Do I worry about COVID? What happens when one of us gets COVID? All of these questions. I was nervous, and I'm not an HR expert, but I know way better than the average dentist. And I was nervous. So I turned to Samantha and Olivia and says, make it happen for me. I paid the fees just like everybody else, and I got what I wanted. I got all these documents in place. Now, when something happens, and you know what, we think of it as it being decreasing stress, and we're all self-centered that way. We think of us, but you know what? Think of your staff. Think of your team member. I hate to use the word staff because I know staff is an infection. Think of your team members, right? Your team members will be happy knowing that, hey, in case things go sideways, here's what happens. In case of bullying, here's what happened. If somebody gets COVID, here's what happens. So it's upfront. Everybody knows what's going on. So we put everything in place, and it made my life so much easier. And because we provide also consulting, so if there's a question that comes up, pick up the phone and say, hey, this is not here. This is the special situations. What do we do here? And it happened to me once, as a matter of fact. And I did call Olivia on our team, and she was able to answer that question for me. So, and I sold that practice a few months ago. When I handed over, the buyer was happy. You know why he was happy? Because he got everything in order. We got all these documents that Samantha mentioned in there: occupational health and safety, compliance, infection prevention and control. All of these were actually in place, and every single team member had read it and signed it. And I handed over the signature page to the buyer. He looked at it and he goes, this is amazing. Thank you very much. You made my life a lot easier. Because again, lease and salaries is really what's first on top of our list, whether I'm buying a practice or whether I'm selling a practice. So there's a lot to be said. We're specialists. We focus on teeth. We understand teeth. Let the lease specialists worry about the lease, and let the HR people worry about the HR. I didn't go to dental school to do anything else but look after people's teeth. I understand there's a human being attached to those teeth, and I'm happy to, by osmosis, to humor the patient that is attached to those teeth. But beyond that, I don't want to deal with anything else. That's where my strength is, and I know where my weaknesses are. There's a lot to be said. I hope we'll listen to some of your questions. This is such a limited time, but it's been a pleasure teaming up with Cirrus again. 26, 25 years as a full circle going back to Cirrus, but I certainly am one of their earliest clients and one of their biggest fans. And Samantha is my partner and my best friend. So I'm happy to be here with all of you guys. Any questions, anytime you have anything, please reach out to us. But right now we'll leave it open to the floor. I believe we have a questionnaire as well, Samantha, that we wanted to put up. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Gabriella. So Samantha, I'll let you take over.
Perfect. Well, I definitely want to appreciate everybody's time. I know we were all kind of talking fast because I think each of the topics or each of the slides that we have are literally a workshop and a webinar each. So we tried to do a 30,000-foot view overview of all of those areas. But if there's any questions that you have when it comes to employment agreements, any of the HR, occupational health and safety, IPC, any compliance, we're here to help. So please feel free to reach out. We're offering complimentary HR consultations. So happy to help out. And hopefully if we have some time, if there's any questions, then we can jump in and answer any of those. Lee, do you know if anything?
Yeah, I think if you let me share the screen, I think
Sure.
it would be good. Ooh. Firstly, I want to say that again, like listening to you two, it's an education for me. And I know when the lockdown, the initial lockdown came in, and we had 500 people on the phone asking what their lease was, do they have to pay rent? I can only imagine on the employment side as well. So again, and that's we'll tackle some questions, and we'll open it up to the floor. And but I think the key message, again, we could probably spend hours talking about individual slides and specifics, but we hope that we've given you a kind of high level view of the situation and how important it is. And your money is better spent being chairside, and that's one of the reasons we've been successful. And Stream Dental, I mean, I would, if it was me, I would just say, here, please take this and help me. But anyway, we put together, I mean, if anyone has any questions, first of all, don't be shy, feel free to use the question and answer service. We won't keep you for too long, but if you can bear with us, I think this is a good part where we can just be a bit more interactive and have some questions. So there's some of the questions that we had before when the webinar, actually, when we went out with this topic. I don't know if Samantha, if you or Dr. Dahar want to speak on this specific one in terms of we'd probably be here for a while, but some of the big changes that we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there hasn't really been some substantial changes when it comes to COVID. I think it just really put a big spotlight on a lot of things that maybe some practices weren't aware of. I know we talked about employment agreements. We've talked about safety and occupational health and safety. All of those things actually were a requirement before, but there wasn't really a big spotlight or precedence on it until all of this happened. And the thing with HR is you don't really need HR until you need HR. And so COVID happened and we all needed HR. And so right now, I think it's just really important for practice owners to really put all of these crisis management playbook in place, to have those resources to be able to turn to. And like Dr. Dar was mentioning, if this happens, then we have structure. It's not jumping into a reactive mode and handling something out of emotions versus being able to deal with something that we were well planned out, thought out, and were able to execute.
Can I add a little something here, Lee and Samantha? It's funny because I hold the license in 6 provinces, and when I went to renew my license, how many of you guys have went to renew your license? Alberta, BC, Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick are those 5, and one of them is on the Northwest Territory. So when I go into renew, it is like 12, 15 pages, and I didn't understand half of the questions, you guys. All of this is compliance, HR, OHS. It's like all of it is just the light. This is how COVID has changed our practice. It's become the focal point now at this point. So what I used to worry about getting enough CE credits to renew my license, and now it's everything else. It's these questions that are coming out of the woodwork. Do you have this in your office? Are you ready to do this? And it's really a challenge, and things have changed. And this is where we come in and we make life easier. Even when it comes to renewing a license, my blood pressure went up a little bit when I was filling those, especially 5 of them in a row. And And I'm not talking about the cost, the 25 grand that it cost me to pay collectively for all of them. It's all the questions that came along with it that made me nervous. Am I answering this right? Am I going to get in trouble? Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. So I'm going to ask you, and I can probably answer the question myself, but when should one be asking for the employment agreements, the documents in terms of when's the best time to start looking into HR from your perspective? Is it straight away, or?
It's absolutely, because it gives clarity to both sides. So if you're considering purchasing a practice, you certainly want to start asking about it right now, because it can, it can be time consuming depending on the situation. If you're about to sell a practice, again, don't wait till the last second. Make sure you renew the lease. Make sure nobody's going to come in. Forget about us coming in. We all know that banks, as soon as you go into the bank and say, hey, I found this beautiful practice, can I buy it? And the first question my banker says, do you have a 10 or a 12-year-old lease? Because they will finance the money. They'll give you the loan based on the length of the lease. So that's how important this is. So don't wait until you're ready to sell, start working on it. The same thing, the exact same thing. Those two topics, leasing and HR, are so parallel on so many levels that you need to get going with this as early as possible. There's no such thing as too early on something like this.
Yeah, I mean, from our experience, I mean, Dr. Dar should come and talk on more of our webinars. You're doing my job for me here. No, but on a serious note, that in terms of a renewal, if you do have an existing lease, we do recommend around 2 years before expiry. That's the sweet spot to at least start the process and engage the landlord. Just to give you the most leverage in terms of, one, if there is, God forbid, if there is a problem, if you haven't got any more options or term, you need that time. If you need to relocate, landlord will be more than happy to just delay and say, oh, we've got time, come back in a year, and then suddenly 6 months you're scrambling and you're going to sign anything the landlord puts in front of you. So from our perspective, in terms of, especially from a renewal, we would say around 2 years before expiry is definitely the time. Not if you've got an option and you've got 6 months notice, don't wait till that 6 months, which again, lots of people do think, well, I'll start the conversation then, and you're losing a lot of leverage. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. So in terms of guidance for acquiring doctors, what are the top mistakes to avoid from a sort of HR perspective, would you say, that maybe you can share?
Samantha, do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, I was going to say, you've got a lot of great experience, personal experience for this.
Well, it depends, because I've gone through most of the stages. I'm not retired yet, but I'm already looking at that it's on the horizon. So as you get an associate or a partner or whatever you're looking for, we get impressed by our colleagues, someone that answers well, someone that dresses well, someone that come across as nice. You need to dig in a little bit deeper. You have to have a clear picture in your mind as to what are you looking for. If you're looking for an associate that's, if you have an associate sitting in front of you right out of school and they say all the right things, but they're only there for 2 to 3 years to acquire enough experience and make enough money to open up their own practice, whereas what you have in the back of your mind is, hey, this associate is going to come in and relieve me and take over this practice in 5 years. Just make sure you're on the same page. There's no harm in asking direct questions. And a lot of people sort of get into this dance when that interview happens, and it shouldn't. It should be as honest and as open as it can be. So making a mistake of hiring someone just because we like them, obviously that's one of the first requirements, but it can't be the only requirement. Just make sure that your goals all align. Otherwise you end up in 3 years, I don't want to say wasting time, but spending so much time educating and teaching that associate, and then they thank you, they shake your hand, and they walk away either to a different city or to a different location and open up an office or acquire someone else's practice. So this would probably be one of the toppest mistakes that I find my colleagues make.
Okay. Anyone else have any questions? Any other questions? I am conscious that we've run over time, and I've really enjoyed tonight's webinar, and I'm sure we could probably spoke for a lot longer. But I would strongly encourage the complimentary review that Samantha, that Stream are offering, and ourselves. We can definitely, get into a little bit more granular situations, your specifics, and see if we can be assistance, because, Dr. Daha, as he said, look, he's done this for 30 odd years. He's had more than six practices. He's sold, he bought. He is speaking from experience, and the reason that he's successful is he's probably had a good team of people around to support him so he can do what he does best. And there's a reason that the professionals have their own sort of expertise. So I would definitely strongly recommend the complimentary lease reviews and the HR review. I want to thank Samantha and Dr. Daha. Really enjoyed tonight's webinar, and Henry Shine for their constant support. And we wish everybody a safe and good evening, and we hope to see you all and speak to you all soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Have a nice
Good
evening.
night.